What kind of data are you looking at in court records?
Yeah. So our project looks at publicly available records, which include, in our county, divorce records, orders of protection or restraining order records, and criminal records. So what we're doing is we're looking, like my research program for a long time has been on women's experiences with divorce when they've experienced intimate partner violence. And so we've done research where we've interviewed the moms and their experiences with divorce. And now this research, we're actually going in and looking at the court records of those divorce cases. And so we're looking at what we can find in their divorce records, any orders of protection they've had, and any criminal records their abusers have had in the past.
What does that tell you that's different from talking to the women? Because you've talked to them in the past too.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we're looking at that we're comparing like what the women tell us about abuse experiences and what actually makes it into the divorce case file. So we're trying to understand how judges make decisions during a divorce, or how decisions are made during a divorce when there's intimate partner violence versus no violence. And so we have these moms who we've interviewed that have told us whether or not they had violence in their relationship. And now we're seeing, does it show up at all in the court case? And that's something that's interesting, because that could be different from what the women tell us, because they may tell us, yes, they told their attorney, but there's no evidence of it in the actual case file for the judge to see this information when reading it, or a custody evaluator. So we're looking to see, do the records differ based on whether or not these women self-report to us that they had violence or not. They also allow us to look at things like what's called legal or procedural abuse, where abusers will file motion after motion after motion to keep women in court a long time without getting a custody decision, or kind of just driving them into the ground financially. And we're able to see, the women can report that they had that experience, but the court records actually tell us what all that looked like, which for women who are going through that process, they just know all of this is coming at them, but they can't tell us the magnitude of it. And we can actually say, there were this many motions with within this short period of time, and how that creates health consequences for moms, and continued abuse for moms.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you seeing a lot of cases where women have experienced intimate partner violence, but it doesn't show up anywhere? Is that a typical? That's the norm.
Yeah. Interestingly, we did not expect this at all. The only way so far that we found that there seems to be a clear systematic way that it's showing up is the grounds for divorce. And so women who reported experiencing violence to us are more likely to file for grounds under mental cruelty. Not physical cruelty, but mental cruelty. So when they file for divorce and they say, what grounds are you filing for divorce? They can select physical grounds, mental grounds, or irreconcilable differences.
Mm-hmm.
And those women are more likely to say mental cruelty grounds.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
It's very interesting. We don't know why yet. We're still looking. But even more interesting is by the time their divorce ends, they've switched from mental cruelty to irreconcilable differences. So we think there's some negotiation process happening where maybe the abuser says, I'll give you this if you change the grounds, so that that's not on, permanent documentation or something like that. We're not sure yet. We need to do more research to find out why that might be the case.
But one of the things that's so interesting to me about that is that you might have discovered that as a scientist, that it's like almost a code word. But if you were the judge looking at it, you wouldn't know to interpret it to mean that.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And I think this will be really good information for us to share with judges that there may be ways this is showing up that could indicate more questions need to be asked about what's going on. There may be some advice being given to women by attorneys to not say physical cruelty. And we do know from the research that attorneys sometimes encourage abused women not to bring up domestic violence during divorce because it could work against them. So this might be some of what's going on.
Why might it be used against them, or how might it be used against them?
We have research showing that when women raise allegations of violence during divorce, that oftentimes it works against them because they are perceived as trying to use allegations to deny the father's custody of the children. Oftentimes women who are abused don't report or share or disclose to other people until they get towards separation process. So it's not unusual for that to be the first time that they do anything publicly to say they were being abused. But from the perspective of the legal system, then that will raise questions. Well, if you don't have any medical evidence or prior protective orders or arrest records showing that this person was abusive, you must not be telling the truth. So there's a lot of questioning of the credibility of women who raise allegations, and it can actually make them appear from the judge's perspective that they're not being cooperative during the divorce process. And so there is data showing that when women raise allegations, it can actually result in them losing custody of their children.
What a catch-22.
It is.
It's a terrible position.
It is. And so one of the preliminary findings we have so far is that among women who have had a history of violence, that those who do get sole custody of their children, they spend twice as long in the legal system to get sole custody of their children. And so they're having to spend a lot more money and a lot more ongoing exposure to that abuser in order to protect their children. When we use the women's self-reports of violence, we categorize their reports of violence or their type of violence they experienced as situational violence and coercive controlling violence. So generally, not all domestic violence is the same. And so this perspective is that some violence is what we usually think of with domestic violence, that has this ongoing pattern of controlling the partner, controlling what they wear, controlling who their friends are, controlling, monitoring their time, that kind of thing. And that dominating violence that we usually think of when we think of like a battered woman type, stereotype, that's coercive controlling violence. It's violence that is aimed at controlling and dominating that person. Another type of violence that can happen in relationships is when one or both partners might become or use violence when they get into a really intense argument, like one partner finds out the other partner is cheating, or one partner says something really hurtful to the other partner and it escalates and there's pushing or shoving and sometimes more severe violence, but there's not this underlying pattern of dominating control. It's more about poor anger management, explosive arguments. So those types of violence, it's argued, look very different and have different needs. So we categorized our sample based on their reports of what they've experienced. And then we looked at their orders of protection and criminal records. And there's a clear difference. So those who have coercive controlling violence are much more likely to have had a history of getting restraining orders and the history of there being a criminal record of the abuser, much less likely among those with situational couple violence. So why does that matter? If we just ask people, has your partner ever physically hurt you? And then we treat all of those relationships in the same way, then we miss really important differences in that coercive controlling violence. It appears those people use the system more. The system is involved in their lives more, police, protective orders, that kind of thing. And there tends to be more long-term danger in those relationships
Mhm.
than with situational couple violence. Doesn't mean situational couple violence isn't serious. It just means the dynamics are different. And when we intervene with those families, we might have to take different approaches.
Does it, if someone has been engaged in coercive controlling violence and they have had a protective order against them, maybe by a former partner or maybe even by this partner during a previous separation, and maybe police have been involved, and then they file for divorce, is there any way that the divorce uh, court processes acknowledge or even look to see if those other things were
It
involved?
varies. It varies. I think it depends a lot on whether or not attorneys are able to get that information in, for example, through a child custody evaluation that would include a comprehensive assessment. But there's also kind of this issue of what's relevant to the divorce and child custody versus not, and that can be really tricky. In our review of the court records, we have found more often than not there's no indication in the divorce record of prior criminal or protective orders.